In this week's Parsha Tetzaveh, we have the inauguration of Aaron as the Kohein Gadol, the high priest, a position in which he will be succeeded by his son and then his grandson and his family after him, making the Kuhuna, the priesthood, really in a sense a family business, a dynasty in the Jewish people, specifically to Aaron and his children. And the Midrash alludes to the fact that Moshe, who during the 7 days of inauguration actually functioned as the Kohein Gadol, was reluctant to give up this role, that it was actually something that he treasured, serving for 7 days as the Kohein Gadol, and that he wished he could continue in this role. Now there's a great deal of discussion as to why Moshe in fact was not chosen as the Kohein Gadol, why Aaron was chosen for this position. But one Midrash gives a fascinating explanation which implies that even though in and of himself Moshe was the more appropriate to be the Kohen Gadol, after all, Moshe was ultimately the greater and holier of the two brothers. So this Midrash says that even though Moshe really was, so to speak, more beloved to Hashem, since Hashem wanted this position to be something dynastic, Hashem wanted this to be a heritage passed down from one generation to the next, this was something that Moshe could not do, because Moshe's sons, his children, did not succeed him. Moshe's children, in fact, do not feature in a significant way in Jewish life. The Gemara goes so far as to identify an incident that happens later on in the Tanakh, the Pesel Micha, the idol erected by a man called Micha in Israel and became a center of idol worship in Israel, and he found a Levi to act as the priest for this idol. The Gemara identifies this Levi as a grandson of Moshe. So it's not just that Moshe's descendants do not recapture the greatness that is found within Moshe, but in fact it seems that this spiritual sensitivity is almost lost completely. And within this idea there are a couple of angles to take. The one is just the basic point, which is made quite clearly over here, is that children do not always succeed their parents, and children do not necessarily continue with the legacy of their parents. It was something that, for example, in Kotsk, in the Hasidic dynasty in Kotsk, they were very strong against, they were very, in fact, disparaging of lineage, of familial descent. There was somebody who came to the Kotzker Rebbe once and introduced himself by saying, "I'm the grandson of so-and-so, a great Hasidic Rebbe." And the Kotzker Rebbe immediately turned to him and said, "So what? So what do you think that gives you something? Do you think that makes you great? I'm not interested in, what your grandfather did. Yeshakach be your grandfather, right? But what has that got to do with you? I want to know what you did." That you have that theme over here is that you can have Moshe Rabbeinu, and yet his children do not succeed him, his children do not continue his legacy. It happens later on within the priesthood itself with the Kohen Eli, who was the mentor of Shmuel, who again hoped that his children would succeed him, but they did not. They were in fact not viewed as righteous people. Shmuel the prophet afterwards wanted his children to do that, they didn't. And all the way back to the times of the forefathers, with Abraham, who was disappointed in Yishmael, with Yitzchak, who was disappointed in Esau. And that it's really not something a father can take for granted that his children will continue with his legacy. So that's the first idea. And the second idea, and that was in fact, according to this Midrash, why Hashem chose Aaron, because in general, Aaron somehow either had the good fortune or the correct formula in raising these children, which would continue in his legacy and in his path. The Maharal of Prague, in his Nativ HaEmet, the Path of Truth, I suppose you could call it a book within a book, or a section within his book of Nativot Olam, it gives a very different explanation, which is fascinating. He says that in fact the problem with Moshe is that Moshe was too holy. The problem with Moshe was that he was too committed to truth. He was committed to such a level of truth and holiness that in fact cannot really find a hope in this world. Moshe was the exception. Moshe was the person who, went up to heaven and received the Torah. There was such a holiness within Moshe that is not something that could be continued. The Maharal gives the analogy. He says that when you have regular food, when regular food becomes impure, we've discussed the laws of purity and impurity a number of times, comes into contact with a dead animal, whatever it would be, when food comes into contact with impurity, so it becomes impure. It's regular food, you can still eat it, just it has the state of impurity. However, when holy things come into contact with impurity, those holy things must in fact be destroyed. You can't simply eat them. In other words, the higher and more sensitive and greater something is, the more fragile and the more susceptible it can become. And Moshe, who was such a great person, who was this awesome person of truth, reached a level that was not easily continued in this world. He reached a level that was not really able to be captured. And so his descendants who were not him, so you might have said, okay, so they're a step below him, but that's still good. He said he was such a great person that this in some way handicapped his children. Yes, he was so great, he was so good, but you take a step beyond that, you take a little bit of impurity and apply that to that, it's destroyed completely. It's not that it's great, just not as great. In fact, it is completely destroyed. So that's the tragedy that's contained within the greatness of Moshe, is that sometimes goals are set to such a high and lofty level that they're actually not continued. And so we have this idea that Aaron being chosen as the Kohein Gadol, apart from other virtues that he surely had, but there's this idea in the Midrash that really it should have been Moshe, but it didn't continue with his children. Perhaps because a person doesn't always merit to have his children continuing, but perhaps within the greatness of Moshe was in fact the downfall of his children, was that when somebody is so very great, it sets something so unattainable for the children that even a small drop from the level of the father ends up in this discrepancy which disqualified them from achieving true greatness in Jewish and in communal life. So the idea is, now that's not to say that Moshe shouldn't have been Moshe, but to understand that greatness comes with a price many times, and there's sacrifices that a person needs to make. At the end of the day, Moshe was Moshe, but the kind of person that he was, his distance from the world, did have ramifications that did impact on future generations. So we should always strive for greatness, but perhaps in this sense, a model for us is Aaron more, is somebody who was more rooted in the world, who was Muravi Mabriot, who loved people, mixed with people, brought them close to the Torah. It's one thing to be a man of truth and a man of God, but we need to find a way to bring that to the people, for the sake of the people and for the sake of our families. Shabbat Shalom.